Hi there, I'm here today to speak to you about numbering scales and why numbering our scales are going to help us understand intervals a little bit better and how scales and chords are built. So without further ado, let's dive straight in. So let's start off by looking at the simple C major scale. For the purposes of this short video, it's not going to be instrument specific, so these rules can be applied to any instrument whatsoever. So our C major scale starts with a C, and we will call that the first or the unison. Obviously, we then label our degrees of the scale going up as the notes go up. From there, we can look at this major scale and turn these into intervals. So the first is also the same note, so we could call it the unison. The second degree of this major scale is obviously going to be our major second. The third, the major third. We're going to skip up to the major sixth and the major seventh. The top note there is obviously the same as the first note, but an octave higher, so we call it the octave interval. The fourth and fifth degrees of the scale are a little bit different. I'm not going to go into too much detail about this, but you should just know that we call those the perfect fourth and the perfect fifth. So these are the intervals of the C major scale. Moving on to our minor scale, if we just take our numbered major scale and we then compare it with our minor scale, so again this is our C major scale and our C minor scale at the bottom, we can see if we understand the numbers of these scales, we understand the degrees of the scale that we're playing, the degrees meaning the number of the scales that we're playing, then we can see that if we lower the third or flatten the third degree of the scale, the sixth degree of the scale, and the seventh degree of the scale, we get our minor scale. So from our major scale at the top, if we lower or flatten the third, sixth, and the seventh degree of the scale, we suddenly get our minor scale. Now, another important thing to mention here is this is our natural minor scale. It's not our harmonic minor scale, which is the minor scale that a lot of us might know a little bit better, where we would raise the seventh degree of the scale. This is our natural minor scale, something that I'm going to come back to shortly in this video. Moving on, we can look at the arpeggio or the triad. This works whether it's a melodic intervals, so if we have the notes one after another like we can see at the bottom of the screen here, or whether this is a chord, so whether these intervals are all stacked on top of each other, which we usually then call a triad. So if we take the first degree of the scale, the third degree of the scale, and the fifth degree of the scale, we have our arpeggio. Again, listen how I'm always moving from the degrees of the scale. So it's important that we think of the scale as in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And we can find that we can find our arpeggio or our triad with any scale. And that, again, like I said, this can be applied to any scale. It's not just the major scale, the C major scale here, it's any major scale whatsoever. The next is our minor. The same thing can be applied with our minor. So we can see that we've got the first, the lowered third there, and the fifth. Again, it's just our minor arpeggio or triad if those three notes were played at the same time. The next one that we've got here is our major seventh. Nothing really to shout about here. Our major seventh does include the first, the third, and the fifth degree of our major scale. And then, surprise, surprise, with it being a major seventh, we add the major seventh. Again, you can see how it's important that we always link the name of these scales, or the major seventh in this instance, to the degrees of the scale. If we know that the seventh degree of our C major scale is a B, we know that we're going to be able to put that in a little bit easier. The next thing to mention here is the dominant seventh. The dominant seventh. Now, if you look at this here, the word dominant is very closely linked to the fifth. So we talk in music about the dominant, a tonic-dominant relationship, and that's the first to the fifth relationship. Dominant being the fifth, tonic being the first. So the best thing for us to do here is look at something else that's built on fifths, that being the circle of fifths. So if we look at our dominant seventh that starts on the C, which is on the right hand side of this screen here, we're actually saying that the dominant is the C, and that dominant is the fifth degree of the scale. Okay, so if we look at our circle of fifths on the left, we would actually be looking at these two scales here. The C being the dominant, we move down 5 notes to get to our tonic, which will be the key of this dominant seventh. We would be in F. F major being having a B flat in the key signature. So if that B flat is in the key signature, we need to apply it to our dominant seventh that starts on the C, which is the reason why we lower the 7th degree of the scale in our dominant seventh. Again, something else that I'm going to come back to shortly about that, but just understanding this tonic dominant relationship is all about the 1st to the 5th, the 5th degree of that scale being important, and that's why we've just brought in this circle of fifths here. Moving on a little bit further now, we are going to start looking at modes. So again, we've got our numbered major scale here, first right through to the octave. And if we think about starting our major scale on each degree of that scale, so starting our major scale on the 2nd degree, which is the D, we get our Dorian scale. If we apply the same thing and start our C major scale on the 3rd degree of the scale, which is the E, we get our Phrygian scale. Moving up the scale, if we start our C major scale on the 4th, we get our Lydian scale. If we start our C major scale on the 5th, we get a Mixolydian scale. If we start our C major scale on an A, we get our Aeolian scale. And finally, if we start our C major scale on the 7th degree of the scale, we get our Locrian mode. And all of these scales, they're funny names, but they are our modes of a C major scale. So you can see that there are many different ways for us to play a C major scale, just starting on a different degree of the scale. And I would urge you to go away and play these different modes and just hear how it changes the sound of that C major scale. It's quite surprising actually that you can play exactly the same notes, starting on a different note of that scale. Suddenly it changes the colour, it changes the sound of that scale. So of these 6 modes that we've got on the screen here, I'm going to talk to you about 3 useful modes. Okay, so we don't need to worry too much about all of them for now. If we're just starting to get into this, 3 of the modes that I would suggest that you spend a little bit more time on are the Dorian, which is the C major scale starting on the 2nd degree, starting on the D, so D to D with no sharps or flats. And this is also known as the jazz minor scale. And if we're kind of opening the door into this area of minor scales now, we can see that if we use that scale, or if we would use that scale over a chord symbol that was our minor 7 chord, and they might be displayed as you can see there, the D minor 7 or the D minor symbol 7. D minor 7 being obviously the specific one for this D Dorian scale. The next mode that's of importance is the Mixolydian, which is starting on the 5th. Now the Mixolydian scale is also known as the dominant scale, and we mentioned this before. And if we think about that dominant scale, that means that the G is the dominant, is the 5th degree of the scale. Again, moving back to our circle of fifths, we move anti-clockwise around that circle of fifths to get from our G to our C scale. C scale, again, we've worked up with this scale all the way through this video. It's got no sharps or flats, which is the reason why we have an F natural. If we were in G, in the key of G, we should have an F sharp, but we've lowered that 7th degree of the scale to make an F natural. So this is our Mixolydian scale on G. And this can be used with the chord symbol, our dominant chord symbol, as the example here, our G7 chord symbol, we would use this scale. The final mode that I want to talk about here, the important mode, is the Aeolian mode, and that's the scale that starts on the 6th degree of the scale. Now this is another interesting one because the Aeolian scale is also known as our natural minor scale. So if we think of a key signature, remember every major scale has a related minor scale with no adjusted notes. It's exactly the same key, and that key is, in this instance, if we were in C, the 6th degree of the scale is our Aeolian mode, which is our natural minor scale. So there we have kind of a whistle-stop tour of the reasons why numbering a scale might be useful when it comes to our knowledge of intervals, our knowledge of how chords are built, our knowledge of how scales are built. It's a great way to look or open the door into the world of jazz, especially if we're looking at our modes. And those last 3 modes that I spoke about there are definitely the ones that you should spend a little bit more time on. So I would suggest you play your scales, start with your major scales, and think about the numbers of each degree of that scale. So as you're playing that scale, think which degree of the scale is this, and then start to build little exercises. Start off with a simple arpeggio, add the seventh, move to the dominant, that sort of thing, but always think in numbers. If you're thinking in numbers, it's going to be a lot easier to apply this idea of bringing in modes, this idea of bringing in different degrees of that scale that are being adjusted. If you want to look at a practical way of applying this, especially if you're a saxophone player, then there is a video linked in the comments below, in the description below. Click on that and it'll give you a few practical ways that you can apply this idea of numbering a scale in something like a warm-up. So thanks very much. I hope you found some of this useful, and I'll see you next time. Thanks.